Thank you all for being here today. I'm Laura Edwards, and on behalf of the Writing and Learning Center at UNC and Carolina alumni, I'd like to thank you all for being here today. What an amazing turnout. We are so glad that you are all here. If by chance you are standing and do not have a place to sit and would like to sit, we've set up an overflow room that will have the audio available. So feel free if you need to take a seat sometime to do that as well. Again, thank you for being here. We are excited to be celebrating our 22nd year of the Tim and Jane Burnett Seminar for Academic Achievement. We are so grateful to the Burnett family for hosting this for all of these years. The seminar was started thanks to Tim Burnett's mother, Mrs. Juliet Davis, and her late husband, W. Burt Davis, and continuing support has been provided by Tim and Jane Burnett. So we want to welcome and thank them today and their daughter, Allison, who's joining them. So thank you. I would also like to welcome Dr. Ian McNeely, who is Senior Associate Dean of the College of Undergraduate Education in the College of Arts and Sciences at UNC, Dr. Kim Abels, who is the Assistant Dean of the Center for Student Success and the Director of the Writing and Learning Center at UNC, and Veronica Glasspolar, who is the President of Carolina Alumni. So thank you all for being here. I'd like to take just a moment to extend my sincere gratitude to some folks who are here today. Our Writing and Learning Center staff have all been super helpful in making this event happen. We are here today with our blue name tags on. If you need anything, please don't hesitate to ask. But thank you to all of them who have certainly helped put this event on. Particularly, I'd like to extend my thanks to Miranda Carlson, who has really assisted me a lot in the planning of this program this year, so thank you. Tania Pettis from Carolina alumni, Janice Brown and Lewis Crow from the Rizzo Center all have been tremendous help, so thank you all. As for some housekeeping items, your agenda is in the program that you have on your seats. We'll be doing a presentation and then taking a short break. During the break, we will have refreshments outside, so feel free to help yourself. And then we'll come back for the remaining part of the presentation and then a short Q&A session. So that's kind of the agenda for today. During the break, we will be collecting questions for the Q&A portion. On your chairs, you should have an index card, and feel free if you have a question for the speaker, you can write those down on that. For our webinar audience today, we are live streaming this, so thank you, webinar audience, for being here as well. If you have any questions for the speaker, you can put those in the Q&A section of the webinar. Okay. If you came in and did not sign in by chance, if you missed the registration table, then I would encourage you during the break to sign in. We would love to know that you are here. So it's right outside the doors. Just check in there if you did not see that on your way in. Restrooms are located just outside the hall and down to your right. So the Burnett Seminar allows us to bring the latest information to neurodiverse teens and young adults, their parents, the professionals who work with them, educators, but also to many more people than that. We have many Carolina alumni who benefit from this, grandparents, professionals of all sorts, mental health professionals, and really people worldwide. So it's a great opportunity and provides such a wonderful service for so many people. This year, we're thrilled to have former UNC Chancellor Holden Thorp as our speaker. Dr. Thorp became, yes. Dr. Thorp became editor-in-chief of the Science family of journals in October of 2019. He came to science from Washington University, where he was provost from 2013 to 2019 and professor from 2013 to 2023. He's currently a professor of chemistry and medicine at George Washington University and on leave to serve as the editor-in-chief at Science. He joined Washington University after spending 3 decades at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he served as the 10th chancellor from 2008 until 2013. He earned a Bachelor of Science degree from UNC, a doctorate in chemistry from the California Institute of Technology, and completed postdoctoral work at Yale University. He holds honorary degrees from the Olin College of Engineering, Hofstra University, and North Carolina Wesleyan College, and is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the National Academy of Inventors, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He co-founded Viamet Pharmaceuticals, is a venture partner at Hatteras Venture Partners, is a consultant to Ancora, Huron, and Urban Impact Advisors, and is on the board of directors of PBS and St. Louis University. He serves on the scientific advisory boards at the Yale School of Medicine and the Underwriters Laboratories Research Institutes. In 2023, STAT named him to its status list of top leaders in the life sciences. In 2025, he was given the Donald A.B. Lindbergh Award for Distinguished Health Communications by the Friends of the National Library of Medicine. He consulted with PBS on their new children's series, Carl the Collector, that follows the everyday adventures of an autistic raccoon. And he has a book titled Leading with Autism, which is scheduled to be released in 2027. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to our speaker today, Dr. Holden Thorp.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Laura. Hello, everyone. I've given this talk all over the country, but not for this many people that I've known since I was 8. So my aura ring says I'm a little stressed out about that, but I will do the best I can. First, I want to, since there are this many people gathered here, just tell you how important the work that Laura and Miranda and everybody at the Writing and Learning Center and Kim Abels do for our students. So, especially since I've started telling people that I was on the spectrum, but even before, I've always sent so many students to these centers, and they do such a great job, and they don't get nearly as much attention as they deserve. And since Kim's boss used to work for me, Ian, I'm going to make sure that I do everything I can to see that they get the resources they deserve. Tim and Janie and Allison, thank you all so much for supporting them. And it's hard for me there are a lot of people in this room who have given me a lot of great advice, and I can look out and say, yeah, I probably should have taken that advice. But there's probably nobody that gave me more good advice than Tim Burnett. So Tim, thank you for all you've done for UNC and for all of us. We're deeply, deeply appreciative. I had no idea when I decided to start talking about autism that it would turn out to be the topic that everybody wanted to talk about and that it would turn into this whole big thing. So I'm going to try to tell you sort of how I got to this point. But first I have to say that, sometimes when I go around and give talks, I'm talking about all the things that are going on in the country and the state of science and stuff like that. And there are a lot of graduate students there. And so after people rattle off all of that stuff that Laura just said, and it says at the top of my thing, please cut a lot of this, but you didn't follow that. I say, well, the first thing I have to do is the reintroduction. Because I don't want the students to hear all those things and think that, they're supposed to imagine that their life is supposed to be like that. So here's the reintroduction, which I don't need to do today, but I'm going to do it anyway, just so that everybody understands the context of it. I say, look, the first thing is, yes, I was the chancellor at UNC-Chapel Hill, but I had a very rough ride. And if you want to learn more about that, you can read all about it on the internet. And the second thing is that you're going to notice that my vocal tone doesn't change very much during this talk, and that's because I'm on the autism spectrum. And so if you have a diagnosis or anything, I hope you're getting the support that you should have. I started doing that, and then I just started getting mobbed after these talks by the students who wanted to talk more about that. And so that's kind of how I found a new calling doing this stuff. And so I'm going to try to tell you, so for those of you who know a lot about autism, the first half of this talk is going to be a lot of pretty rudimentary stuff. But because there's so little awareness about all this and we need so much more, I'm going to tell you some of the things that I've been able to learn as somebody who's on the spectrum, but also as the editor of the greatest scientific journal in the world. Since nobody from Nature is here today, I get to say that. And I hope that you find some of those insights enlightening, and then more of the stuff about my own journey and what I think we could do in the future is in the second half. But it's a lot of talking. Laura made the schedule, so if you leave at intermission, no shade on anybody who's here. I'm going to start off with this. You do not have to worry that this is going to happen in this talk, okay? All right, and if you think that's funny, then you came to the right place. We will not have breakout groups, no butcher paper. We won't have to talk to the person next to you. There won't be any icebreakers, okay? And by the way, if you inflict those things on people, stop, all right? My people do not like that, all right? And we all feel like that when people start with their quizzes and all that kind of stuff. All right. So first about the history of autism, these are kind of the three biggest players. All three of them controversial in some ways, but made major contributions. So Leo Kanner was a professor at Johns Hopkins who first noticed that there were children who had different symptoms from schizophrenia that he started to call autistic. He gets kind of a mixed rap in the autism world. He was a pretty caring physician, I think, and his fans will say quite passionately that we owe a lot to him. But he also believed that autism was caused by distant mothers. And so a lot of people correctly don't like that. Now, it was 1943, and there was another guy, Dr. Bedelheim, who was doing worse things than Leo Kanner. So that's kind of the Leo Kanner thing. None of these people have a simple story. This is Hans Asperger. He was working at the same time as Kanner. He was in Germany. Initially, it was thought they were working completely independently, but later it was discovered that Kanner had access to Asperger's research. Asperger viewed the spectrum as much broader than Kanner did. Kanner was very focused on children who we would say now have very high support needs or have what some people call profound autism. Asperger noticed, more people like me and some of the more famous people who are autistic, who, he called the absent-minded professors even in 1944. But Asperger's legacy is complicated by the fact that he was in Germany, and it's disputed, but some people believe that he referred children with higher support needs to various kinds of eugenics programs. That is not universally agreed on, so that makes the whole thing very complicated. And then this is Lorna Wing. She is the first person to describe Asperger's as its own subtype for what we rarely call now high-functioning autism, but this is me and Elon and Bill Gates, and all of us are in this Asperger's category. And she knew at the time that she was opening Pandora's box by doing this, because lots of people who are more affiliated with the profound autism or higher support needs end of the spectrum don't think it's a good thing that she did this. But she's probably the most beloved of the three of them. But we wouldn't be here talking about this without these three people, for sure. And so when Lorna Wing described Asperger's syndrome in her 1980 paper, she listed these 5 traits: fixated interest, apparent lack of empathy, difficulty making friends, clumsy movements, and one-sided conversations. But she said to Steve Silberman years later, that she knew this was opening Pandora's box because she said quite presciently, Asperger's shades imperceptibly into eccentric normality, right? So are you eccentrically normal or do you have Asperger's? And that is a completely subjective determination that hangs over the field to this day. 20 years later, John Constantino, who was with me at WashU, who's one of the people who's taught me the most about the science of this, published a really important paper that showed that autistic traits, regardless of whether they rose to the level of a diagnosis or not, were present in nearly all of the population. And he said another kind of fateful thing here. Given the continuous distribution of these traits, it may be arbitrary where cutoffs are made between research designations of being affected or unaffected with a pervasive developmental disorder. But what's most important about this is that autistic traits are present in everyone and especially in the siblings of children who have greater presentation of autism symptoms. All right, this is Simon Baron-Cohen, who's another big player in this whole thing. He is Sacha Baron Cohen's cousin, and they do look alike, and I think they get along. Which is a good thing because he gets asked about that all the time, but he is Sir Simon Baron Cohen. He has some controversial views about this like everybody else, but he's also one of the great teachers for me in this field. And he developed something called the Autism Spectrum Quotient, which is probably the most widely administered instrument for determining whether people have autistic traits. And you can get between a 1 and a 50. 33 means maybe you are autistic. I got a 40. I wasn't sure if that was right, so I had Patty do it again, pretending she was me, and she got a 43. So, so I'm pretty sure I wasn't fudging it. And you know, I don't know, I can look at some of these. I notice small sounds when others do not. Yeah, I'd say, you know, there are a lot of things on here that I identify with. But when I asked him, so there was a thing on Channel 4 about autism, Channel 4 in England, that Simon was in, and he ended up administering this test to millions of people. And I asked him what the biggest surprise was, and he said nobody got a 0. So when millions of people are tested, there's absolutely no one that doesn't have at least one indication of some autistic traits. So autistic traits are like the water, right? And so a lot of this weight that has become attached to this is, in my view, a little unnecessary because we all have some amount of autistic traits. And whether I have Asperger's or I just have more autistic traits than other people is something that we spend way too much time being caught up in. Then this got even more contentious in 2013 when the DSM, which is the manual that psychiatrists use to make diagnoses, combined all of autism into one thing called autism spectrum disorder. We used to have Asperger's, PDD-NOS, which stands for pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, which means Asperger's with a speech delay. And then we had what we now would call probably profound autism, but we now call it all of it autism. And this is another mentor of mine, Richard Brinker, who is a colleague of mine at GW, who has a daughter who would be in the old PDD-NOS category. And he's an anthropologist who studies the effect of culture on autism. And he liked that it was merged because he said that lowers stigma for my daughter and other people like her to have you know, people who've done a lot more in life saying that we're autistic. But the flip side of that is that, so Simon Baron-Cohen was initially against it because he said, you know, there are different manifestations of autism across the spectrum, and we don't really understand them all yet. Simon now favors calling everything autism and then calling some of it autism that co-occurs with an intellectual disability. And you know, people are going to keep arguing about this forever. But the thing that kind of put me into a better awareness of this. So this is someone named Carrie Cariello. She is a co-author of this book, Autism Out Loud, which is by 3 moms of kids with autism. And I asked her, I said, and her son had a speech delay, and he, I think, probably has some intellectual disability also. And I asked her, I said, so do you think your son and I have the same family of traits? I mean, we both give long monologues about our fixated interests that bore people. We stare at that light instead of looking at you all in the eye when we're talking to you, and you know, we miss nonverbal cues. And she goes, yeah. The difference is you know you can do that, and even though you have a hard time stopping yourself, you can talk about it, you're aware of it. And my son, if you said, Jack, stop talking about airplanes, he would say why. He wouldn't understand. He doesn't understand why people don't want to hear about airplanes. And you know, this really hit me that this is kind of the way we should be thinking about this rather than getting in this big argument about who's autistic and who isn't. I have the privilege of being able to talk about autism, and so do a lot of other people on the spectrum, but Jack doesn't have that privilege. And then Constantino, you know, also kind of gave me the reaffirmation of that on the medical side. I'm going to tell you a little more about Jack in the second part of the talk. So there's, you might have seen this article that was in the New York Times about whether we should split what is called profound autism off from the rest. And there's one good thing that would come up with this because, you know, we're bogged down in this whole question of whether there's an autism epidemic or not. But all of the growth is in the people who are in my category. And profound autism has had a little bit of growth, but not nearly as dramatic. So we could wipe out the whole autism epidemic question by just focusing on profound autism and saying, do we have an epidemic of that? The answer is definitely no. And this is Allison Singer, who is kind of the leader of this movement. She runs something called the Autism Science Foundation, which is seeking to get research money for profound autism. This is her daughter, Jody, who has an intellectual disability and has to live in a home. And Allison is, like a lot of the moms in this movement, fighting for better things for her child. And up here, here's Elon Musk, who clearly also has Asperger's, who said, I never went to therapy on my gravestone, which is about the worst thing you could say if you wanted to help other autistic people. But, you know, Allison is saying these two people don't have the same diagnosis, and, you know, it kind of makes sense. The problem is not everybody who looks like they have profound autism has an intellectual disability or is incapable of doing things. This is Hari Srinivasan. He's not the same one that's on PBS NewsHour. But Hari is non-speaking. He uses an iPad to communicate, and he has a full-time caregiver who's with him all the time. But he is going to be the first non-speaking autistic person to get a PhD in American history from Vanderbilt. This is me using the virtual reality setup that he built, which shoots bubbles at you, and you pop the bubbles, and depending on how close the bubbles are when you pop them, it changes. You can measure someone's sense of their personal space. And autistic people have a different sense of our personal space. And so you can measure this and then correlate it with other autistic symptoms and stuff like that. And Hari's a pretty famous guy in the autism world. So if you were to carve off profound autism, you might include Hari in that category, and he certainly has lots of things to contribute to the world. And so a lot of, and a lot of other parents of profoundly autistic children deeply object to having it carved off because they feel that it devalues the things that their children have. So when people ask me about this, I say, look, I shouldn't be part of this decision. I can talk about autism and do what I want to do. we need to have the profound autism families and caregivers and clinicians agree on this. It's kind of a cop-out because that agreement is never going to happen. This is typical of the debates we have. Now, getting a little more into the science. So Constantino published another, well, actually he's not an author on this, these are his collaborators. There's another famous paper in JAMA that shows that if you have twins, and you study all the twins and who has autism and who doesn't, and the identical twins and all those things, you find that 80% of the risk of having autism is heritable, which the way science works is like the same as 100% because that's about as much as you could measure. Now, we'll probably see some other things. That doesn't mean that environmental factors aren't important because some of the mutations that we inherit are the ones that we get from our parents. And for people on the milder end of the spectrum like me, that's all of the genes that we would have that just happen to combine in a way for us. But people with more severe presentations of autism have what we call de novo mutations. Those are ones that the mother or father picked up, probably from some environmental factor before the baby was conceived. And that mutation that might be causing a more severe presentation of autism is not present in the DNA that either mom or dad were born with. And this, so environmental factors could be causing that. If you look at the heritability of the kind of variants that Asperger's people have, only about 50% of that is heritable. So the remaining part is these de novo mutations. And this is why it's so hard to explain to a family. I mean, I've talked to a lot of clinicians about how hard it is to talk to people about this. And the real answer is that it's just so unbelievably out of their control that they just happen to have some mutation that one of the two parents picked up. Could have been from anything, could have been just random errors in DNA replication. And that's why their child is born this way. And I just feel so much sympathy for people who, first of all, may have a hard time understanding what I just explained to you, but also just feel such a loss of control. And that, I think, is driving a lot of the conflict that we have. Now, this paper is really important. There's a guy, Stephen Shore, who's a famous autistic storyteller and stuff, and he worked with us on Carl the Collector. And he has a saying, if you've seen one autistic person, you've seen one autistic person. And the reason for that is actually in the science. So it's easy to notice that that you meet two autistic people and they're different. Buck's grandson last night asked me, he said, why does Carl the Collector have such a, he said, meh, I think means boring, vocal tone. And I said, well, because a lot of autistic people like me have a hard time modulating our vocal tone. And he goes, well, yeah, but I know a lot of autistic kids at school who can modulate their vocal tone. I said, that's it, you got it. So Asher's ready to be an autism clinician because 20 years ago, this paper was published showing that for people who are interested in genetics, autistic traits don't breed true. That means you can have two autistic siblings who have the same overall severity, but one might have more fixated interests and harder time making eye contact, and the other one can do that, but they have more repetitive movements or something like that. And it's very unknown. I asked Constantino why this is, and he said, I don't know. To be honest, I can't tell you. So I'm looking for an autism geneticist who can tell me that they know why this is. Now, this is another important paper that a lot of people in the autism world are looking at now. Unfortunately for me, it's in Nature Genetics and not in one of my journals. But now we have the ability to sequence the entire genome. And so this is a study, and the Simons Foundation has, for the last decade or so, been accumulating whole genomes of children who have autism diagnoses of various kinds. And if you take all of the DNA and you look for the genes that are correlated with autistic traits, you find that they break into 4 categories, which are kind of the ones we've been talking about. So moderate challenges, that's the sort of old Asperger's crowd. Broadly affected, that's folks with much, much greater support needs. Social and behavior, that's autism co-occurring with other psychiatric disorders like anxiety and depression and PTSD. And then this is autism with a speech delay. And so these are the 3 old DSM categories plus another one for co-occurrence with other psychiatric disorders. And then they have the siblings of a lot of these kids who aren't autistic. And you know, you can do analysis on this till the cows come home. But one of the most important findings here is that intellectual disability, which is a little bit elevated even in the moderate challenges, but the speech delay and broadly affected are way over here in cognition. And then you have sleep disorder. Yeah, I was working on these slides at 3:30 this morning. But, and so the most important thing about this is that even though autism in the minds of some people is one whole continuous thing, here it's 4 different things. And so which one of those is correct? Well, since one of my autistic traits is that I take everything very, very, very literally, they have to both be correct if they're both factual. So you have to come up with a way in which they come together. And I think it's simply because the traits are, you know, as Carrie told me, her son has fixated interests, so do I, and somebody with profound autism is clearly even more fixated than we are. So fixated traits of interests are probably completely conserved all across the spectrum, but at the same time, there's obviously, it's like cancer, there's multiple diseases here. So what have I told you so far, in case some of it was, I went too fast or showed too many graphs. So autistic traits are all on a continuum. No one gets a 0 on the AQ. So congratulations, everybody here has autistic traits of some kind. Yeah. The less severe profiles, like the old Asperger's, are real. We can see those. And we can also see that co-occurring with a speech delay, intellectual disability, or other psychiatric disorders. We cannot predict the trait profile from the overall severity. That is a result we've had for 25 years that hasn't been challenged. And an intellectual disability is a very crucial parameter, but it's also not completely predictable from the pattern of traits. And if you want to tell me I have Asperger's, I'm in the jury still out on whether Asperger collaborated with the Nazis or not, because the person who told me he didn't was Steve Silberman, who I'm going to talk about in a little while. So I don't think we know the answer to that. But I'm happy being in a separate category. I'm happy if you say I just have a lot of more autistic traits than somebody else. And I'm okay if you say I have autism because you want to believe that they're all the same thing. I think even though there's a lot of noise on the internet about this, I think most people who are in my category also agree with me about this. They're just not nearly as loud as all the people who are raising hell on TikTok about this kind of thing. All right, so the fight then is over what is the real autism. Is all of it the real autism? And we have these subsets where autism co-occurs with these other disorders. The good thing about that is that it lowers stigma for everybody. To have lots of people doing lots of different things who are autistic, or is profound autism the real autism, and all these other things are people with a lot of autistic traits who have these various other characteristics. And I think the advantage of that is that it pays greater tribute to the families and caregivers of people who have much, much higher support needs than many of us. So I could make a case that either of these is the right one. but there are lots of people who have much stronger views than I do who would fight all the way to the wall that one of these is the right one. And basically it's Richard Grinker and the neurodiversity crowd up here, and it's Allison Singer and the profound autism crowd down here. All right, well, in my opinion, this is not our biggest problem when it comes to the fact that we're living in a sea of misinformation about autism, and we actually want to help the actual people rather than fighting over how to characterize everyone. So I'm going to spend the rest of this time and after the break talking about these 4 questions. So the first is, how do we understand how far people with a lot of autistic traits or autistic people should push themselves to be integrated into the neurotypical world? And that doesn't have a straightforward answer. How do we understand when autistic people with autistic traits can and how they can blend in without sort of being dishonest with themselves about who we are? How can neurotypical folks better accept our traits so that we don't have as many people feeling isolated because they have autistic traits? And then how do we get the autism community to be respectful to each other across the spectrum? In my view, if we could solve these things, we would be in a much better place than we are now. So I'm going to tell you about a lot of famous autistic people that I've met. This is the most famous autistic person. This is Temple Grandin. And Temple Grandin, if you don't know, you can watch her life story on HBO Max, where Claire Danes played her and won an Emmy. Temple had a speech delay, so she would have been in that green group on that chart that I showed you earlier. She invented revolutionary ways to care for cattle. That's her fixated interest. She's able to picture herself as being one of the cattle. Every time I talk to her, which is many times now, she changes the subject to cattle within the first 10 or 15 minutes, but then I change it to something to my thing. And so we have an absolutely great time talking to each other. When I first contacted her, I'd met her before, but when I first contacted her that I was working on this, she said, I really want to talk to you because to me being a scientist is more important than the fact that I'm autistic. So she doesn't see autism as, even as famous as she is, as the defining part of her identity. And she's mostly critical of people who don't push them, autistic people, children and their parents, who don't push their kids harder to integrate into the neurotypical world. And that's because of her life story. She broke herself into the cattle industry, and you can see all this if you watch the movie, which she has told me many times is very accurate. All right, this is John Robison. He wrote the biggest selling autobiography of an autistic person. It's called Look Me in the Eye, My Life with Asperger's. It was long before we got rid of Asperger's as a designation. He also had a speech delay, so he has a very similar profile to Temple. He made exploding guitars and other equipment for KISS. He was actually on the road with them, and he has a lot of fun stories about that. But I said, what's it like being on the road with these guys? And he goes, well, to the world, they're this big rock star, but to me, they're just a guy with a broken guitar. So in a way, it's good to be an autistic person who doesn't get caught up in all the whatever's going on backstage at these concerts. And he now has a very lucrative business fixing extremely expensive collector's item Porsches. And he, like Temple, is also critical of the neurodiversity movement, which I'll say some things in a minute, and kind of what he sees as overprotecting some people who could push themselves more. But like I said, this is easier said than done, because we really don't know precisely how to push everyone. All right, this is Bill Gates, who was really the first person that I ever heard of as having Asperger's. But in the 70s and 80s, 90s, when we were talking about that, Bill had not acknowledged that he has Asperger's. But he disclosed recently in his autobiography source code that he would have been on the spectrum today. Like Temple Grandin, his parents pushed him in the neurotypical world. He has been widely mocked for his dancing at the Windows 95 launch, much like another autistic person with a very similar profile who was mocked for his dancing only a mile or two away from here. Yeah. So these are, I'm giving you what some people, cynical people in the autism world call the autism of the rich and famous, celebrity autism. And it's very important to realize that Bill Gates and I, for sure, and definitely even Temple Grandin and John Robison, you know, we have many privileges that a lot of people in the autistic community don't have. And so, so while it's a good idea to try to push people as far as you can, it's not so obvious that you can do that with everyone. So I get a lot of people saying, you know, we got too many guys in their parents' basement. We got to push them out there and make them do stuff. And yeah, we want to, but as Simon Baron-Cohen told me, some people, if you did that, their stress levels would be so high that they would be in serious danger. This is Dave Caudell. He's an autistic person who helps run the Frist Center for Autism and Innovation at Vanderbilt. And he works really hard on helping autistic people get employment because, you know, there's a statistic that runs around that only something like 30 or 40% of people who are diagnosed on the spectrum have jobs and are independent. And so this center at Vandy is very focused on getting more autistic people employed. And I said to Dave, I said, how do you do it? He goes, well, I'm working individually with somebody and I push them to do a little bit more. And if they struggle, then I pull them back a little bit. Or if they can do more, I push them. And I said, well, that's great, Dave. And I'm sure you're good at that. But not everybody has Dave. And this is the hugest challenge that we have, which is if you've got Dave, I'm sure he can get you to the right point. Or if you have Laura, I met one of the students that Laura's coaching today, and he's so fortunate to have her to help him, and he's going to be fantastic in the world. There's no question about it. So if you have Dave or Laura, then you know, we can find that out about you where you need to fit along this continuum. But if you don't have resources and you don't have access to these things, which most people don't, you know, that's how we end up with a lot of people who are getting left behind. And also how we end up with a lot of people who push themselves so far that they're in danger. And so this is one of the first things that we really need to solve. Now, the neurodiversity movement is the farthest kind of on the spectrum of saying all autism is autism, that whether it's clinical and scientific or not doesn't matter. It's about your personal lived experience. The leader of this movement is someone named Devin Price, who I've interviewed, and I'll have a quote from him later in the second talk. His book is called Unmasking Autism because his theory is that the people who are out in the world undiagnosed, who are autistic but are trying to blend in, that there's a big psychological toll on that. I agree with that. And that this is a disability rights movement, the same as for people with all kinds of other disabilities. But you know, I would say it's important to remember that being able to decide whether to mask or not is a privilege that not all autistic people have. And sometimes I worry that their rhetoric tends to lose that. Now, we haven't talked yet about the fact that about 3 or 4 times more boys than girls are diagnosed with autism. And a lot of that is because of difference in the presentation, because girls feel a greater social pressure to mask than boys do. If you're a guy with 2 English last names who's the first person to solve the Rubik's Cube on national television, then the fact that you're autistic doesn't really surprise a lot of people. But if you're a girl, that has all kinds of complicated sexism and sociology baked into it. This is a great book about this called Off the Spectrum. that I recommend to you. And here's a video. Oh, do we have sound? Yep. Okay. Do I need to start it on here? Oh, yeah, there it is.
What the real reason is. It doesn't interest me so much to know, oh, Charles, how do you feel this second? I don't care, actually. I do care about, Charles, what are you doing? What are you thinking about? So I sort of gravitate towards people who are doing things all the time. And I think more about everything that I'm doing, things that I'm working on, things that I'd like to work on, things that I'd like to accomplish. That's where I'm best.
All right, now
what the real reason is.
This is a very autistic behavior that she's exhibiting. I have no idea if Martha Stewart is on the spectrum or not. I'm not here to speculate on that. But caring more about what people are working on than about their feelings is classic autistic behavior. Those of you who know me for a long time maybe never realized, but you probably did, that when I first met you, the first thing I said to you was, so tell me what you're working on, all right? Because like who you're married to and your kids and all, it takes me forever to absorb all that. And so I can see many of you that I've done this with, okay? That's how I climbed the ladder in academia, right? Because when you do that, professors say, oh, Holden's such a good listener. Yeah, yeah. All I did was say, so tell me what you're working on and wait 15 minutes, right? All right. So when I do this, it's okay. If Elon Musk and Bill Gates did what Martha Stewart did in that video, everybody say, right on, build me a rocket, build me a computer. But Martha Stewart got no end of flack for this, okay, because people expect that a woman is going to be much more socially connected and going to care more about people's feelings. And, that's nothing but sexism. And it's really, there are a lot of women and girls with autism who really, really suffer because of this. So before we take the break, I just want to kind of set the stage for the next part, which is, what if we didn't need masking at all? And that's really what the neurodiversity movement is all about. So Steve Silverman wrote this book. It's 10 years old now. Steve sadly died about a year ago. I had the opportunity to interview him once before he died, and he was one of the great people who encouraged me to go out and start doing all this stuff. He was one of the people who really encouraged me to go out and start doing this. He said, how do you know you're autistic? And I sent him the YouTube of that Thriller video. And he wrote back and said, good, we needed to talk. So, so his book, Neurotribes, is the whole history, and it lays out the whole idea that, that neurodiversity is a part of human experience, and that if we could accept it more, we could get more different kinds of people in different roles who think differently, and people would feel more included in things. And the thing that's interesting to me about this is a lot of people say, oh, well, now this whole Asperger's, neurodiversity thing is way too overdiagnosed. Well, the reason people seek a diagnosis is because they need support. So if we could accept autistic traits more and ADHD, I'm not an expert on ADHD, but I'm sure all this applies to that. If we could accept autistic traits more, then fewer people would be getting a diagnosis. And maybe we wouldn't feel like we had an epidemic. And so we have to have, was somebody snapping their fingers? Huh? Right on, okay. I didn't expect to get any finger snaps in this crowd. Y'all look a little old for that, but so if we could tell better where autistic people should fit in and how far we should push ourselves, if we gave them tools to adapt, those would both be good. But they're only going to work if we can also have society accept autistic traits as part of human behavior. Now I'm going to tell you about one last concept, and this will all set the stage for the second part of this. And that is something that is very big now in the autism world called the double empathy problem. So autistic people And this very much applies to me. We lack cognitive empathy, but we have affective empathy. So there are many of you in this room who've said to me, you know, when I met you, I didn't really know what to make of you. I couldn't tell if you were that interested in me. And you were staring off into space, and I started talking to you, and you just like wandered off. But then something important happened to me, and you were the first person who showed up and wanted to make sure I was okay or wanted to congratulate me on how great it was. And that is because, and that is a illustration of this very thing, the double empathy problem, because I can't really read from your face or your body language. I mean, how does a body have a language? What you're trying to tell me. But if you tell me in words, or if it's something that's so important that I don't need to interpret it, then I'm very interested in making sure that you're okay, or that that we're celebrating the fact that you're happy. And you know, some people I never reach this point with, and they just always think that I didn't care about them. So because of that, a lot of people think that we, as Lorna Wing said, don't demonstrate that we have any empathy because we're asking you what you're working on. You know, we're not trying to find out about your children and all that stuff the first time we meet you. And, you know, we might be staring off in the other direction because your face isn't telling us anything useful. So people think that we don't have empathy, which actually isn't true once we know there's a signal there that we can do something about. But in the other direction, and the reason it's called a double empathy problem, is that that you think that that's because of us, and not because you haven't adapted to the fact that this is our expression. So you don't think we have empathy, we don't think you have empathy, and that's why this is called the double empathy problem. And so the solution to this is, you know, for us to be more aware of all these things, but also for other people to realize that, you know, this is just how some people express themselves. And the hurdle to this so this guy, Noah Sasson, is a very excellent researcher on the social side of all this stuff. And he did this kind of depressing experiment that showed that neurotypical people make decisions about autistic people and whether we're paying attention to them within less than a second, you know, microseconds probably. And so that is going to be very hard to overcome. And that'll be important in the second part of this. So what I've told you about are a bunch of different categories. So there are some people who have autistic traits, but not enough challenges to seek a diagnosis. That's everyone in this room who isn't diagnosed, but some of us more apparently. There are some people who have autistic traits, but with challenges, but we don't have a diagnosis. That's lots of people, including many of the celebrity autism world. There are people who have autism with a diagnosis but haven't disclosed it. That would be me for several years and Bill Gates and a lot of other people. There are people who've disclosed it, but they don't consider it to be part of their primary identity. That would be me also, but also Temple Grandin and John Robeson and people like that. And then there are people who are on TikTok talking about how they're autistic and it's the main thing they do. And there's a lot of opinions about all these. You can already tell that, you know, to me, these are all driven by facts, so these are all legit to one degree or another. And what I hope is when people hear me talk about this, if they want to go read Unmasking Autism and make TikToks, they can go do that. If they want to learn about their traits and get on with life, they can do that too. Or if they want, you know, you get to choose which one of these you're in. And so my goal in life, and I think for sure Kim and her colleagues at the Learning Center are doing this, which is how do we create a world where everybody can find out where they fit in on this chart. And I've done 1, 2, 3, 4 of these. So in the second part of the talk, I'll tell you what that was like and introduce you to some of the people who helped me figure out what I was doing. So I think now it's intermission. Is that right, Laura? And so I'll give it back to you. Y'all do know that people in the autism community from all over the world come to Chapel Hill. to be near the services that you have here, both on the medical side and also, where's Laura Klinger? Where'd she go? Oh yeah, because of Teach. And Laura Klinger is here, and so is Tom Shopler, or maybe he left. But Tom's father, Eric, was a great, great pioneer in autism research, and you have lots of great people on the genetic side, because Joe Piven's lab is one of the absolute best also. So I meet people all the time who are grateful for the supports that are here for autism around the world. In fact, the first time I ever found out about, first thing I ever learned about autism was a conflict between the medical and neurodiversity side that happened here. I had no idea what they were talking about, but they were very animated and they were lined up outside my office. So little did I know that I would end up doing a lot of work to try to understand this. Okay, so I tell people that the work I'm doing on this, and I know there are a lot of experts here. I've calmed down, but with this many psychologists, I mean, if I screw anything up, just let me know. Of course, I have 2 children who are psychologists, so they would have let me know this long before now. What I try to do are 3 things. One is interpret the science for people as someone who didn't do any of it himself, but can understand a lot of it. Share my own experience, which I'm going to do more of here in a minute. And then, because I've spent the last 5 years hanging around with journalists, and because, as you all know, I was the subject of journalism for quite a long time, I try to do some journalism on the autism community, and that's why I talk to all these people like Temple Grandin and Allison Singer and all these folks. So I'm going to try to share a little bit of my own story first and relate it to some of the things that I was talking about, and then try to bring it all together at the end. And then I guess we have a lot of time for questions too. All right, so might as well go back to the beginning. This is me in middle school. And it was the 70s, so that's the haircut. And as a child, I read at the age of 3. I didn't know that was something called hyperlexia. I was a terrible athlete. That's why I'm holding the bag of basketballs rather than actually playing. I was a bad actor. My mother ran the community theater in my hometown, and I was in the shows when I was little and with Sharon Brown, who's right here. And when I was 12, I got fired by my own mother because I was a bad actor. But fortunately, there were a lot of things at the theater that needed to be fixed and taken apart and put back together again. So I spent a lot of time doing that. I didn't have a whole lot of trouble in school. I don't know if I was aware that I missed nonverbal cues, when I was in middle school. I certainly had a lot of fixated interests in music and making films and all the kinds of many stereotypical things that you would run through. I had a small number of close friends. A couple of them are here from my childhood. Where did Paul go? Oh, there you are. There's Paul Pascal, my neighbor across the street. My best friend from my neighborhood, and my best friend from my school, Nick Robinson, is here. And so I had a small number of very close friends, including those 2 guys who are still showing up at my talks here 55 years later. When somebody says, I think my kid or my husband might be on the spectrum, I always say, how do they react when plans change at the last minute? And if you don't want to ask somebody this if they have their drink in their mouth, because they're likely to spit it out. And then I have a very hard time leaving projects in the middle. So when I was negotiating the contract for my book, my agent said, the publisher's worried you won't turn it in on time. And I said, did she read the proposal? The proposal is about how I'm absolutely going to turn the manuscript in on time. All right, so here are the people I grew up with. This is me and Nick Robinson when we were kids. Nick is the complete opposite of me when it comes to autistic traits. I had many of my closest partners do the autism quotient. Nick got a 3. that is the lowest I've ever known anybody to get. We'd have to ask Simon what percentile that is, but it has to be very, very low. But of course, I'm the one with the movie camera. You know, I was just very fortunate that I had friends like Nick and Paul who could perceive what was going on and tell me, and who didn't lose patience with the fact that I didn't know what was going on. And these are all the people that we went to all 9 grades of school with. And this is us only 2 or 3 years ago. Nick is, of course, as the person with an AQ of 3, our organizer. But my daughter, who's a social worker, said, "Dad, I wish all my clients had a middle school group chat." And we're lucky to have each other. And they accepted me, and they picked me last in kickball anyway. But they were happy when I fixed all the equipment and all that kind of stuff. This is Carl the Collector. I hope some of you have a chance to watch it. This is our new show on PBS. This is Carl. He's an autistic raccoon that Buck's grandson likes. And these are Carl's friends who are all neurotypical. And the show is about how he learns how his traits affect them, and they learn to accept his traits. And it's kind of hard not to get overwhelmed when you're watching this, unless you're autistic, and then you just look at it and go, well, that's, you know, what the story they're telling me. But it's really amazing story, and I'm going to spend the rest of this talk really talking about this interplay. I'm not going to talk as much in this part of the talk about people with high support needs, except at the end, because, you know, this is for the Learning Center, and it's about people who actually end up coming to college. So these are the kinds of people that I'm going to be talking about. But, you know, I benefited enormously from having lots of neurotypical partners in my life. And so here's me mostly getting by. You know, I had resources. There was no way I was getting a diagnosis in 1965 or 66 or whenever I would have gotten one. But I could have afforded to get one if I wanted. My parents were supportive of me. I had neurotypical friends who accepted me. I did not go to a big public school where things might have been much tougher in terms of my traits. I went into chemistry where I could talk to people about my fixated interests all day long. And then I went into academic administration where I could talk to college professors about what they worked on. Most of the tasks that I was given when I was coming up in the university were to fix some problem. And if you want a problem fixed, you want to ask an autistic person to do it, that's for sure. And again, as I said, here's me being the first person to solve the Rubik's Cube on national television when I was 17. I fit the autism stereotype. And that is an enormous privilege if you're a cisgendered white male who's autistic compared to anybody who has any other marginalized identity on top of it. And so, you know, when I tell people I'm autistic, they think I'm Rain Man or Sheldon from The Big Bang Theory, and they don't have to, like, imagine what that's like. My children used to wonder why I watch the TV without turning it on. Turns out, you know, there's a lot of great things on it when it's off. And I've been getting this, I'm monotone in my lectures since the very first set of teaching evaluations I ever got. This one's actually only 3 years old. That's covered up by the subtitle. Okay, now before I get into anything else, I just want to talk about something that's really important, which is autism, especially for those of us who have resources and don't have an intellectual disability, is not an excuse for anything. All right, so if, you know, this person did this thing because he's autistic, or, you know, Boris Johnson said that he was spectrumy, you know, saying I've got the autism and spectrumy, you know, we should really stop doing that. That's disrespectful to the people who have serious challenges with autism. The way we talk about this is really important. But more importantly, I did a lot of dumb things because I was autistic, for sure, and so did every other autistic person. But that's my responsibility. I'm smart enough and had enough resources to figure out how to deal with that. And so if Boris Johnson really is on the spectrum, then he should be serious about that. This is a guy that many of you may know. This is Eric Garcia. He went to Carolina, and he is a reporter DC reporter for the Telegraph. You see him if you watch YouTubes of politicians getting grilled. You will see Eric asking his questions quite frequently. He's going to be in the last part of my book, so I'm excited about that. But this is his book, We Are Not Broken, which I highly recommend also. So all the dumb things I did in my life that could be associated with my autistic traits are my own problem and nobody else's. All right, so here they all are. So y'all, I'm sure, remember many things that you either noticed or wonder why I was doing them. Probably the biggest thing in management that autistic people worry about is when somebody tries to tell them something but doesn't tell us in words. And then later they get upset and you ask them, why, what's wrong? And they say, well, I tried to tell you I was upset. Well, if you don't try to tell me with words, then I'm probably going to miss that. But it's also my responsibility to ask you to do that. Being a chancellor, you get a lot of different inputs. And it's very hard to integrate those. And you have a hard time ending conversations. And I apologize to everybody who had to wait to talk to me just now. But that's because I have no way of knowing when you want to stop talking. So that's why that line went all the way to the back of that door there. And why I ran into the bathroom eventually, because I couldn't figure out any other Actually, I didn't know to go to the bathroom. And I blurt things out, no question about that, and I've hurt a lot of people's feelings doing that. This is the thing I struggled with the most when we were starting to have all the challenges. So y'all are laughing and listening to me because I'm doing this very sincere delivery that comes across as being sincere and how I'm telling you things. And that's how I got most of these jobs, because this worked in a job interview incredibly well. But the problem is when things get tough, there are all these people who want you to go out and be Michael Douglas and the American president, or Jed Bartlett, or somebody like that, and I cannot do that, all right? So this delivery that you're getting from me with, deadpan humor and all that, that's the only delivery I have. And when people started to tell me to do something different, I got myself really tied up in knots. Now, one problem I had more at WashU than here is sometimes somebody comes to your office and tells you about this terrible problem, and for some reason, they don't actually want you to fix it. Now, why did you come to my office and tell me about your problem? All right, now, the psychologists in the audience can explain this. They just want to be heard, and my kids, love to hassle me about this. But so I spent a lot of time fixing problems that people just wanted to complain about. And why you want to complain about them, I have no idea. Now, the other thing is, a lot of times when you're a chancellor, somebody tells you about some problem they want fixed. And it's a really terrible idea to do what they're telling you. Like, it's based on a completely unsophisticated view of how higher education works. And the really good chancellors, and Kevin was good at this, will say, that's an interesting thought. I'll get back to you on that. All right? I cannot do that. All right? Like, the best I could do is say something like, that's probably not our priority right now, which is better than saying, let me tell you why that's the worst idea I've ever heard. So these are all the challenges I had. And I had no idea they were associated with having autistic traits at the time. You can read all about it in 2 books and a podcast and all over the internet, so we don't need to go over how I ended up leaving. But if you're going to read a book, I sure recommend reading Andy Thomason's book over reading Jay Smith's book. I gave Andy Thomason's book to my mother, and she said, oh, now I know what happened. But I did not give her Jay Smith's book, I have to say, and I told him that. So there's more than enough about all that. But I went to Washington University in St. Louis. I worked for this guy, Mark Wrighton, who was very much like Erskine Bowles, even though they looked and their affect was completely different. The great thing, I felt like I was a great chancellor when I was working with Erskine. I don't know if I really was or not, but part of the reason why I was is when I went to him with a problem, he just told me what I should do. He didn't say, well, what's your recommendation, or, tell me your decision, or something like that. And so once I had that confidence, I could carry out whatever it was that he asked. And Mark Wrighton did the same thing for me. Now, if you meet Mark Wrighton, a lot of people thought Mark Wrighton was on the spectrum because he's got his double-breasted suit and it's buttoned, and he wears it buttoned when he's sitting down. And he has these very peculiar, a lot of people think peculiar mannerisms. But Mark Wrighton's cognitive empathy is totally off the chart. So Mark Wrighton totally understood all the people that were working for him, including me. And he had me completely figured out. But so he did with all my other colleagues. And so a lot of people look at the two of us and say, Mark was on the spectrum and I wasn't, because his mannerisms were more conspicuous than mine. But it was precisely the opposite, which is all the more reason why, all this generalization doesn't work. I love being a provost. That was my job. If I'd stayed in academia, I would have just been a provost again. I talked to people the same way I'm talking to you now. But eventually, as these dramas always happen, people wondered whether I was going to take over for Mark or not. So we had a psychologist come and do a whole assessment of all the people that I worked with, and a bunch of them told her that I had a lot of social challenges and that they suspected that I was on the spectrum and that it was before Asperger's was merged, Asperger's. And she told me I did, and that was the transition. Like I said, the only thing I knew about autism at that point were that people used to whisper about Bill Gates having Asperger's, and I knew all about this conflict between the medical and neurodiversity autism groups here at UNC. That was basically my whole, and Rain Man. I guess I knew about Rain Man. A lot of people noticed when I was at St. WashU that I had PTSD. I can't imagine why I would have PTSD. But I do. And it does co-occur with autism very, very easily. So I didn't stay to succeed Mark because I didn't really, I came to realize that everything that I struggled with here wasn't just because of the athletics program and the decals. Sorry, Tim. So I went to a job that I was much better suited to do. So I'm now responsible for the most important scientific information in the world, which is a perfect job for an autistic person. And science is the most widely circulated and one of the most highly cited journals in the world. And we do not just research, but we do news and commentary. And I love doing all three of those things. And you can't come work for us unless you take everything extremely literally. So I don't have any of these challenges with, oh, what did you mean by that? It does frustrate some of the neurotypical people in the rest of our organization when they try to work with us. But it's our job to come up with a rational explanation for everything that's ever happened in in the history of the whole universe. And we all have the right kind of brain for doing that. And so it's really a privilege for me to get to do this job. It was a perfect one for me. So I knew I had an autism diagnosis when I went to science. And I had developed, in collaboration with the same psychologist, a bunch of different tools for managing that, like saying to people when I first meet them, yeah, I know I'm hard to read. Sister Bernice wrote the same thing on my second grade report card, so I was aware of that for a long time. And that, if you come to my office to tell me something, you need to tell me whether you really want me to fix your problem or not, and don't try to communicate anything with me if you're not explicit about what that is. And I would always have some euphemism like, well, I'm really busy, so I don't always pick up on things or stuff like that. The person who was the executive editor when I got to science was a very intuitive person who got me immediately. And so she and I were able to kind of collaborate on me not sharing my diagnosis, but still having lots of workarounds. And she was always able to tell me stuff that was going on that I was missing. But I read this book, Neurotribes, and I read also this book by my colleague Richard Grinker, which I recommend to you, called Nobody's Normal. It's all about how stigma is a result of culture. especially around capitalism and our obsession with the way brains work and with psychology and stuff. So these are both really terrific books. And both of these guys, and Simon and Temple, all encouraged me to start doing what I was doing. I was most nervous about, because of my experiences here with Teach and Joe Piven's group, about whether I would talk about this in a way that was offensive to people who had children with higher support needs than I had. Because, I'm the editor of Science, I've had a great career, I've done most of the things that I wanted to do. Most of the challenges that I've had with autism are first world problems, to say the least. And so for somebody who can't get dressed or, needs, they call it, I hear some of the moms call it cup of sugar autism. You can't run out and get a cup of sugar and leave your kid alone for that long. So how was I supposed to be respectful to them? But Simon and Temple and Steve, all these people really helped me. And that's why right now what we do is we talk about low support needs and high support needs. If somebody wants to change the terminology, that's okay with me. But I got to the point where I started feeling comfortable doing that. I hadn't told my kids about my diagnosis, but I don't know if there's anybody here from the social work school, but my daughter went to the MSW school at WashU, where she had to do a differential diagnosis of her whole family. I was mostly interested in their diagnosis of her mother, which I didn't get to see. But mine was autism spectrum disorder, so good for the professionals at the WashU School of Social Work. And so I just gradually started telling people I was speaking to, and I started getting lots of people coming up to me afterwards, especially the students who were on the spectrum and wanted to talk to me. The first time I got up in front of my class and said, "Hi, I'm your professor, and I apologize for the fact that my vocal tone doesn't modulate very much, but I'm on the autism spectrum." It was the most liberating thing I've ever done in my life. Like, I wasn't going to get that teaching evaluation that called this out, and I didn't have to try to overcome that. So I started telling my friends, and then like I said before, I've had autistic traits, but not a lot of challenges when I was a kid. I've had challenges with no diagnosis. I've had a diagnosis but disclosure, and then I decided to do disclosure. And I had no idea it would get as big as it did. I was not expecting this at all. It started with this piece that I wrote in Science, and then I wrote this much bigger. Then, I'm very unhappy about what RFK is doing with regard to autism, but it's very good if you're trying to get a lot of publicity in this environment. So I wrote this piece for the New York Times, and this piece for Stat, and now recently read, this was in Stat, something about somebody talking about autism, prominent autistic people from Greta Thunberg to Holden Thorp. I guess, there's no going back now. And this is me on a podcast that I hope you'll listen to called Why Would I Trust You? This is Rachel Bedard, who was on Ezra Klein talking about the Make America Healthy movement. And these are two moms who are convinced that their kids got profound autism from the MMR vaccine. And the four of us tried to have, and I think we succeeded at having a talk about this. And I learned a lot the whole time I've been doing this, because the experience that these moms have, so, they thought their kid was normal. The kid got the vaccine. They started noticing that the child had autism. And, it's this devastating thing that doesn't have an explanation that you control. So as maddening as it is, if you talk to these folks, it's absolutely understandable why they would come to this conclusion. And if our goal is to try to change their mind, first of all, we're not going to be successful. And I think what would be better is to try to convince them that we are looking for the truth and doing it in a sincere way. And if they want to know what we think about this, they can ask us. But in the meantime, we're going to continue to try to get the truth about this. And then I started talking about this in graduation speeches, and now I'm giving a graduation speech. I got another one for next spring. So I enjoy doing that. And then as I was said earlier, I'm working on a book about this. And the reason is because I think if somebody has been told they're on the spectrum, they're in college, or they went to the Learning Center and somebody said something to them, not somebody who's diagnosed as a brand new child, and they go home and Google autism and they see all these people yelling at each other. They don't really have, most of the books in this field have a strong point of view on one side or the other of this. And there isn't anything out there that I've been able to find where you could read about your traits, you could decide, okay, now I know where they come from, I know they're real, I've heard from Holden and a bunch of other people about what they did about it, and I can just go do that now and not have to get my diagnosis. Or, I realize this is a big deal, and now I can read about how I could go join the neurodiversity rights movement or go get a diagnosis or whatever it is. So I'm trying to write something that would be for that audience and their loved ones and their coworkers. And it's the same 4 questions that we've been talking about. So I'm going to try to go through what I'm thinking about these. So the first one is, how do you know how much an autistic person should be pushed to integrate in the neurotypical world? And up here, this is a paper from an excellent researcher in Edinburgh named Catherine Crompton, talking about how much more comfortable autistic people are when we're around other autistic people. And look, we got a secret handshake, y'all, okay? So we can connect with each other very quickly. And I don't believe in this whole telepathy tapes thing. That's a rabbit hole I wouldn't go down. But it's definitely the case that autistic people like being around other autistic people where we don't have to mask our traits and we can go on and on about our fixated interests and nobody cares. And we can have awkward silences and nobody thinks that's a bad thing. Today when I was sitting with the students, we were all sitting at the end of the table and there were several moments where nobody was saying anything. And I wanted to blurt out, hey, the autistic people are perfectly comfortable with this silence right now. But Laura eventually asked a question or something like that. And a lot of you probably watched How to Dance in Ohio and Love on the Spectrum. These are all about autistic people being more comfortable when they're together. But, you've got Temple Grandin saying, I want kids out there shopping and I don't want parents protecting their children from all this. And this is John Robeson with Ace Frehley. So he was obviously hanging around with rock bands and able to do that. So how do you know where you are on this? Okay, we really, other than individualized therapy, we don't have an answer to this. But we have wearables, we have AI, we have all kinds of tools, and I'm trying to get some of the scientists working on this to work on this problem. Because we can't possibly generalize individualized therapy to everybody who needs this. All right, now in higher ed, this plays out in a number of different ways. So the most extreme, there are autistic people, and Jack, who I showed you earlier, is one of them, who live in a community with only other autistic people, and they don't go to a college together, but they go to local community college classes. And there are many autistic people getting college degrees this way. But they're completely contained in an all autistic community except when they're in class. Then there are dedicated colleges. The 2 biggest are Beacon College in Florida and Landmark in Vermont. This is Beacon. It's near where my home is in Orlando, and I went up there and spent the day. And it's a college that is all about, all the students there have various kinds of developmental disabilities. There is ADHD and autism and dyslexia. But the faculty there are completely tuned in to doing this, and they graduate people who get jobs, and I talked to a lot of the graduates, and they're doing great. Another big one is in Arizona, which is a mainstream college, but has a very elaborate program called SALT, which stands for Strategic Alternative Learning Techniques. So it's doing a lot of what's being done here, except on a much larger scale, which, Ian, you could do here if you wanted to. Okay, no pressure. So glad I got out of that business. And then you have sort of what you have here, which is students who are, have diagnosis and are getting accommodations and support, hopefully, or maybe not. That's something that needs to happen. But thankfully, Laura Miranda and her colleagues are doing that. And then you have plenty of autistic kids who are going to college doing fine. They're playing Dungeons and Dragons and doing whatever. So this is Jack. You can see Jack's holding, that we met earlier, he's holding his class of 2027. He's going to graduate. He lives in a one of these communities with only other autistic people, but he goes to community college, and he's got his job at his grocery store. If you really want to understand all this, I really recommend Carrie's social media and everything. This is all about him having his job at the grocery store. They're all really happy with this. He is, and this is this is the system working. But his mom doesn't do anything except focus on this. So we can't give that to everybody who needs it. Now this is somebody I met who's got a lot. I don't know how much of what I put about her in my book my editor is going to leave in, but it's pretty awesome. So I'm going to definitely put the whole interview on my Substack. So this is Agnes Callard, who was the subject of this very big profile in the New Yorker, which I recommend to you. Agnes is a philosopher who is autistic, very similar profile to mine, I would say. This is her second husband, who was her graduate student. When she fell in love with him, she went to her husband and said, "I'm not in love with you anymore. I'm going to marry my graduate student." She didn't have an affair with her graduate student. She didn't, pretend like she wasn't in love with him. So let's just say Agnes is very transparent about her personal life. And there's a lot of great stories in here. So it kind of sucks for her first husband, but but she and her new husband, who I've met, are, they're happy, and he is as neurotypical as you can possibly get. This is her book, Open Socrates. It's about the absolute literal reading of Socrates. So a lot of philosophers read Socrates ironically, which means they don't, they interpret it. And Agnes's scholarship is all about, let's read Socrates to the absolute letter, which means things like, you can't ever really tell somebody whether you've chosen the right path in life, because by the time you're asked about it, you're already doing it. And so therefore you can't be objective about whether it was a good decision or not. All right? So think about that. All right. But she can pull all the quotes from Plato and show you everything. So I asked her, how do you get by? I said, first of all, this is a very autistic reading of Socrates. She goes, oh, I know that. But I asked her, I said, how have you gotten by? And she said, my husband and I got together because we were both interested in Aristotle, and when we realized we were in love with each other, we had never had a conversation that was not about Aristotle to that point. All right? So I'm glad she didn't try that with Patty. That wouldn't have worked out so well. But she does say, I felt like if I'd been diagnosed earlier, I would have figured this out sooner, and it could have helped me. And, I'm focused on how do we, so she survived by staying in her fixated interests in a very extreme way. And so how do we all do that? That's what we have to try to figure out, like what is the right answer for different people. But as I've said, I think a lot of autistic people like Agnes and me, and Dan Aykroyd, whose partners were Bill Murray and John Belushi, or Bill Gates, whose partner was Steve Ballmer, or Temple Grandin, whose partner was her science teacher, or John Robeson with Ace Frehley, or Carl and his friends. The interaction of low support needs autistic people with neurotypical people is how a lot of us have gotten by in the world. And so I asked myself, what is it about me and Temple Grandin and Bill Gates and the people we've been talking about who were able to form these relationships? Well, all of us got diagnosed relatively late. Temple got diagnosed more as a child. And all of us either were in the moderate challenges group or had a speech delay, but profound autism. We all had resources and support for our parents. None of us had an intellectual disability, and we all probably, partly through good luck, found partners who wanted to understand us. And so I asked a lot of my closest partners in life to do the AQ, and the highest any of them got was 12. So most of the people that, Buck got a 7. So, most of the people that I have partnered with are people who are complementary to me. But that means that I feel comfortable enough with that I don't feel like I have to be in an environment with only autistic people. So these are things I had going for us. And so you'd say from this, okay, everybody should push themselves in this way. But there's another important thing about autistic people, and that is we're very easy to lie to. Because since we can't read your facial expressions and your tells and everything, if you say something to us in words and you really mean something else, we don't have a clue. And I've had the biggest problems with this, and it's very hard online. You know, when you have jobs, even like the one I have now, people write to you all the time. You write back, then they write to you again. They start telling you about their emotions and things like that, and why they're disappointed and stuff. And those are real words you can interpret. And it doesn't come naturally to all of us that, you know, you're supposed to start ghosting that person right then. I made a lot of mistakes around that. And so that's why, and our actions can be easily misinterpreted. So one of the most common things that happens to autistic boys in college, which I'm sure Laura's aware of, is that, you know, they get accused of stalking people. And they're not stalking people in the way that we think of. They're just looking for information. And they don't understand the cues of how to not do that. So, you know, when do we decide all of this is too much to push people? So that's another sort of continuum that we have to try to sort out. Now, the other one is the self-help industry. It's really better for autistic people not to read this stuff, I have to tell you. I know Brene Brown is very popular, and she's got a great delivery and all that. But, you know, daring greatly is maybe not the best thing to do if you're already vulnerable. Like when I was going through all my troubles, so many people, maybe many in this room, sent me Brene Brown's TED Talk and said, this is what you need to be more vulnerable, all right? Well, if you can't read vocal cues and you're easy to lie to, then being more vulnerable maybe is not the best thing for you. And, you know, same thing with emotional intelligence. Well, you know, when I first met the shrink who diagnosed me, she said, do you think you have emotional intelligence? I said, sure. She goes, why do you think that? And I rattled off the 5 points that Daniel Goleman makes in his book, which I had memorized. And she said, I said, isn't that emotional intelligence? She said, no, you actually have to do that. So, yeah. And Brene Brown is talking about effective empathy here. She's saying, you know, that's what causes burnout. You don't want to get caught up in other feelings. Well, if I don't use effective empathy, I don't have any empathy at all. So somebody needs to do the autistic version of all of these talks. My wife is at a 6-day meditation retreat, which is why she's not here. If I went to that, I'd have to leave in an ambulance. Because the last thing I need is more time in my head. Like, I need to get out of my head. And so a lot of this stuff, you know, it sets unrealistic expectations. You know, we're always going to fail about this. In my opinion, and, you know, I've asked Brene Brown about this by email, but she hasn't responded. You know, I think it's kind of ableist about cognitive empathy to tell everybody to dare greatly and have emotional intelligence. It certainly sets us up to be manipulated. And so there's not as much research on this as I would like. I asked Simon and a few other people if they knew of anything, but we need you know, the irony is this, we need tools for people to help themselves, but the tools that are out there for people to help themselves are mostly written for neurotypical people who don't have the same profile we have. So that's another reason why I'm out here doing this. All right, now, so that's kind of how far do we push people. The second thing is, should we mask our traits? Now, every autistic trait comes with a good side and a bad side. If you have the cognitive ability and, you know, low enough support needs that you can act on the good side. And this is another, for people who have need a lot of support, this is where we have to be very respectful, because it's true that autistic traits for me come with a downside and a plus side. But if I can't leave my house, my autistic traits really just come with a bad side. And I really don't like it, and I think we need to stop people from saying that autism is a superpower. And you hear that a lot, and it's not good, all right? Because, yeah, maybe it's a power for me sometimes, but if I'm taking care of a child who can't take care of themselves, it sure as hell doesn't look like a superpower to me. So we ought to probably just stop saying that autism is a superpower. But for those of us who are out in the world, all of these things come with two sides. So I'm very good, I think, at being sincere and being seen as a straight shooter, at seeing things that other people don't see, at getting things done and being focused, and making decisions sometimes sooner than I should. But in universities where people can't really make decisions, that's usually a plus. And I can certainly, eliminate a lot of uncertainty, and if something big happens to you, I can probably help you out. But there are a lot of people in the neurotypical world who also want leaders to be able to give a commanding performance, to be vulnerable and have emotional intelligence, to experience nuance. So this is really hard. Like, if you want to break my brain, tell me that you want Carolina to be Harvard Monday through Friday and Alabama on Saturday. Okay. You don't frickin' get to do that. All right, you have to be the University of North Carolina 7 days a week. All right. So when people started telling me that, I just went home and crawled in a ball on the floor, because I don't really know how to process something like that. But that's a new one. What they're really saying is a legit thing, which is, I like it that we're a good university, but I want to win the games also. And you can do that, but you have to make certain sacrifices to get there. Was the TV guy still here? Was that good enough? You going to use that? Okay, all right. So I'm so glad I don't have to worry about that anymore. Right, so these are the things that we, how much of the world does the world need these? How much does the world want these? Of course, the answer is we want both of these, right? But mixing them has been really hard for us. And Simon told me one thing that I take to heart, which is, he says, who would I want to live next door to? I'd like to live next door to an autistic person, and I wouldn't want to live next door to a psychopath or someone with an antisocial personality disorder, which means they have high cognitive empathy and low affective empathy. And it's covered up, but it says, even if they would make a great politician. So I'm very happy that my profile is not good for a politician. All right, so, when I started off as chancellor, I was still doing most of the stuff that I'm doing today. So I ran into a DTH reporter named Kellen Moore, who has a different maiden name now. She's doing comms at the University of Colorado, and I was there giving a talk. And she said, I used to write stories about you. And I said, oh, let's look one up. So we looked up this story that she wrote, where a bunch of protesters came to South Building, and they were protesting for the housekeepers. And Brenda Kirby called me in the car and said, there's protesters coming to the building, and I said, keep them there, and tell them I want to talk to them. So I got there, and I went out and started talking to them, and I said, all right, 2 of you and a couple of the housekeepers can come in my office, which they were absolutely not expecting. So they came in there and they gave me all their demands, and my quotes, I was so unfiltered, it's awesome. Like I said, the governor doesn't need me to tell her how to do her job. I'm not a politician. And then they said, well, you get paid too much. Can you cap the administrative salaries? No, because we have to make it appealing to be an administrator at UNC. Like, college presidents aren't supposed to talk like this. Yeah, I just didn't know any better. So, by the meeting's end, both parties had reached a sort of harmony. And I said, well, this is definitely a better forum than a protest. So, this is how I was. This is the real me. But of course, when I started having problems, people started telling me, oh, you got to act mad, or you got to, stand up for this or that. This is the answer. And, I'm sorry, but a lot of your tax dollars were spent on coaches to try to get me to give the performance that was somehow magically going to get the University of North Carolina out of its big mess. And none of that worked. And the reason I was bad at acting mad is I wasn't, here's another good quote for TV. I wasn't actually mad at anybody because there were people doing their best in a corrupt system. It wasn't the individual people that should have been blamed for anything. So I was just really bad at faking, like, let's throw individual people under the bus over this whole thing. And that frustrated a lot of people. But 15 years later, after I learned all these things about myself, I got an email from the Congressional Office of Congressman Brad Wenstrup of Ohio, who asked me to come testify before his committee because they thought that the scientific community, the National Institutes of Health, Tony Fauci, and the journal, with the journal's complicity, were covering up the origin of COVID. And they wanted to talk to me about that. I didn't get subpoenaed. I might have if I didn't go. So I went to my boss and we said, well, what should we do? And he goes, what do you want to do? I said, well, why don't we just go answer their questions? Because we don't actually have that much to hide from. And, you know, they might be surprised that we did that. So we wrote back to them and said, yeah, we'll come. And they invited my counterparts from Nature and The Lancet. They didn't show, and which was great. My boss loved showing this picture of me with my, like there was a time when they said, well, we want to call one other witness. And he said, you tell them you're not coming if they call another witness, because I want that picture. So there's me with these two empty chairs. There's a bunch of my neurotypical partners back there. They're being very somber, I have to say. You know, my class is about scientific controversies, and they watched the hearing this week, and then on Monday we talked about it. I said to one of my students, what do you think? She said, they were very surprised that you just answered their questions. Yeah, I said, what else was I going to do? So, you know, when they said yes or no, I said yes or no, whichever the answer was. Yeah, how hard is that? Yeah. And so the people who were trying to implicate me in this grand national conspiracy did not succeed at doing that. And in fact, until today, most of you had never heard that this hearing even took place, which is the goal of every congressional hearing if you're the witness. But when we were preparing for the hearing, you know, I had a lot of high-priced DC consultants, of course. And they said, okay, we're going to have a session about your facial expressions and your body language and your hand movements. And I said, no, we are not. I said, I'm going to be the most sincere witness they've ever seen. And I don't need to perform. If you ask me to perform for them, this thing is going to go off the rails. So this is something autistic people can do. All right, so that's kind of us about masking. And now, you know, how should the neurotypical world adapt to us? I mean, I strongly recommend both of these books about this. You know, we want autistic people in every role. We don't want every leadership role taken up by an autistic person. We don't want any job taken up by someone from the same neurotype. But we definitely want more autistic people who can get things done and make a decision and you know, go to the charrette where y'all are writing on all that butcher paper for some unknown reason. And we're staring out the window, and eventually someone says, and y'all are just like coming to an idea that's whatever the loudest person in the room has, right? And the least controversial, which is why our journals publish papers on why this stuff doesn't work. But there's one person who's staring out the window, and if you ask that person their idea, they're going to tell you something that not everybody else is talking about, which will be something different. And we need both. You know, y'all have your breakout groups if you've absolutely got to have them, but we should be able to opt out of it and send our ideas in separately, and I'm confident if we did that, we would get a better result than either one of those in isolation. So we need to reduce stigma for everybody, including people with higher support needs. That would lead to fewer autistic people seeking a diagnosis, I believe, and also more autistic people employed and using fewer public resources. So there's a lot to be gained from this, and it's also the right thing to do because autistic people are human, and we have a lot to contribute to the world, and mocking our traits and treating them as inappropriate for certain roles is really not helping anyone when you think about it. So this is kind of my grand theory of everything, which I've laid out for you. We need to find the Goldilocks spot for autistic people in the world, and we need a general way to do that. We need to give autistic people the tools to better function in the neurotypical world without betraying who we are. And we need the neurotypical world to adapt, to accommodate neurodiversity. And none of this can happen unless we do what may be the hardest thing, which is to get respect and turn down the temperature in the world of autism itself. We can't ask the rest of the world to turn down their temperature if we can't turn it down for each other. And this is the kind of thing you get. I don't know who Christina is, but she watched this online. She can send me another tweet, I guess. So in my piece, I was, in an effort to be deferential to people who have higher support needs than I do, I said something about the form of autism I had, which of course I'd had a bunch of experts review and tell me that that was an appropriate way to say that. And she objects to that because now she's saying there's only one autism. It's, and this may be her belief, but it's really not constructive to accuse everybody else. But I'm optimistic because, so here's two people I interviewed on the complete opposite end of this. This is Devin Price, who is the most visible person on the neurodiversity rights end. And he says we need to stop being so dogmatic that we can't find valuable information in scientific places that are less comfortable. That's brain science, genetics, research, biological aspects of disability. And this made me excited. The truest answer is a synthesis of that stuff, a synthesis of both the biology, the cultural, and the economic. And so good. So if the neurodiversity end could say the science is okay and all of these different ways of viewing the truth are important when it comes to neurodiversity, that would be a huge step forward. And this is Allison Singer, who is the leader of the Profound Autism movement. And when I asked her about this, she says she described her daughter. She said that she has profound autism, has a severe intellectual disability. She's mentally nonverbal. She has self-injurious behaviors. Sure, Allison will always say Asperger's and never anything about low support needs or any other term. But she, so this is very different from Asperger's. But I got her to say, and I think she believes this, they're not more important, they're just different. Well, if we got everybody on the profound autism end to agree with that, then we might have actually a chance at bringing all these people together. And the good news is that most of the people I talk to aren't the loud voices. They're the people, if they've got a kid with a lot of needs, they're just trying to get through the day and hope and praying that there's a way that their kid will be independent one day. And if they're on my end of the spectrum, they're trying to get their coworkers off their back because they stare out the window and blurt things out and hurt their feelings and all these other things that we're prone to do. And so there aren't that many people that are this loud in this whole thing. But if we can even get the loud voices toned down a little bit, that could really give us a chance to work on all this. So I'll end with this, and thank you all for inviting me. And there's so many people in this room that I love dearly that I've been staring at the screen most of the time rather than looking at all of you. But I can't thank you enough for coming to the talk and all the things that you've taught me over the last, who's known me the longest? Sharon Brown? The last 57 years. Yeah. So thank you all very much. Okay, are you the moderator? Laura's the moderator?
Dr. Kim Abels is going to be our
good.
moderator.
Okay, even
so
better.
Here you
Great.
go.
We've been here forever. If y'all need to leave, don't worry, go ahead.
Thank you all, and thank you, Holden, for sharing your perspectives and giving us so much to think about. And thank you all. We've got a big stack of questions here. So we are only going to get to a few, but I will pass these along to Holden.
Okay.
So as he's doing his research and writing, that he may find some thought-provoking things that we weren't able to get to. How's that?
Okay. And you picked some that you're going to
Yes,
do? Okay.
we picked some
good.
to do.
All right.
So, and some of them are about diagnosis.
Yeah.
Some of them are about science, and some of them are about supports.
Okay. How many are about football?
None about football.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. I was hoping 0 was the answer to that question.
Yes. So these first couple are about diagnosis. And so in what you have learned, are there similarities between presenting symptoms of ADHD, autism, and then there's some questions about co-occurrence with epilepsy,
Yeah.
OCD, PTSD, etc.?
Yeah, well, I've decided autism is a big enough field on its own that I don't need to go do all this for ADHD. There's a great book that the same publisher that I'm working with did called ADHD for Smart-Ass Women.
Love the title.
So most of what I know about ADHD I learned there, but I do meet a lot of people who say, you know, I have ADHD and autism, and there's certainly a lot of correlation. Actually, one thing that that John Constantino told me about the science that worries him is he's worried that a lot of in these gene samples of autistic children, that a lot of the non-autistic siblings have ADHD. And he's worried that that is a confounder in the science. So that is to get worked out. But certainly the co-occurrence of lots of things can happen with autism. And you know, anxiety and depression, of course, are the biggest because they're the biggest overall. But ADHD, dyslexia, synesthesia, and there are experts in the room here who could rattle off longer lists than I can.
Great.
Yeah.
Someone asked about the pros and cons of using that AQ
Yeah.
as a self-assessment.
Right.
And then there was someone who also asked about how does it compare to something called the RADS-R?
Okay. Yeah, I know the answer to those questions. Well, I don't know about using the AQ to diagnose yourself. I mean, when people call me up and say, you know, am I autistic? I said, well, the one thing I can tell you for sure is that I don't have a license or the qualifications to tell you the answer to that. And, you know, you can't get that from reading my book either. But I think even if you ask Simon Baron-Cohen, is the AQ a test for autism, he would say, no, it's a test for autistic traits. Mm-hmm. And whether those autistic traits rise to the level of you needing support for them, while he proposes a kind of cutoff in there, it's, as we've said, the traits don't breed true. So many, you know, you could have a subset of the traits that is such that you don't need support. You could be in an environment where you don't need support because, you know, like I was when I was a kid or something like that. And so the diagnostic criterion is whether you need support or not. It's not about whether you have a lot of autistic traits. And that's something that only you and your clinician, I think, can determine. Now, the RADS test is very, very comparable to the AQ. A lot of people would say it's a little more serious test. It's much more frequently used by people who are making the actual diagnosis than the AQ is. The advantage of the AQ is that it's been given to millions of people. And so the statistics on the population that you get from the AQ is much better, but I'm pretty sure the diagnostic people prefer the RADS test. And I got right in the same place on the range on both of them. So I think they're very comparable.
Great. Some questions, science related. One is about research. Excuse me, you mentioned some research about gender disparities. Anything about racial disparities in the identification of autism?
Yeah. I mean, there's a ton of that. any marginalized identity makes it harder to get diagnosed, harder to get access to a diagnosis, and comes with more stigma. So if you're a nerdy white male, then you have every possible advantage when it comes to this. And anybody who's missing, who doesn't, has something else on top of that, gay, trans, different racial identities, all of those things make it harder to access a diagnosis and harder for the diagnosis to work, because the diagnosis was built for people who look like me. And my folks were the standards. And so, yes, that is something that we really, really have to work on. And that's why getting these tools that would be objective somehow could make a really big difference.
Mm-hmm. Anything that the STEM fields might do to adapt better to support people on the spectrum within their
Yeah, well,
community?
I get, most of the time when I'm giving these talks, I'm at some university where everybody here is a science professor, not somebody I've known since I was 7. So we have lots and lots of conversations about this, and it's incredibly important, but it's really a readout of the overall problem that we have in the culture of science now, which is that we say on our websites and when we're talking about it that we built the scientific enterprise for the graduate students and the postdocs, but we don't really act that way. The powerful people in science who have a lot of grants, who publish a lot of papers in my journal, who have a lot of power, they're really the powerful ones, and many of them have not bought into this at all. So the most common thing I get is, I got my diagnosis, but I don't want to tell my advisor. And it breaks my heart when I hear that. So the best thing we could do for neurodiversity in STEM is the same thing we could do for almost every other problem we have in the sociology of science today, which is that we could live up to what we say when we say we prioritize our graduate students and postdocs over everybody else in the enterprise. If we did that, then those are going to be the people who are mostly struggling with this and thinking about this and seeking a diagnosis. And if we don't stigmatize them, then the rest of it will probably work itself out. And at the same time, we'd be making it better for people with other marginalized identities and people who have less power. When research integrity would probably get better because they wouldn't be scared of their advisor when they're making their data, and just about every other problem would be fixed if the graduate students were running the scientific enterprise and not the guys with the high H indexes.
Great.
Yeah.
I think we'll ask you one more, and then we have a comment to wrap up.
Okay.
Thoughts on AI and research, and any promise in anything connected to?
Yeah, so I'm asking every clinician and scientist who works on this, if there are technological solutions that we could generalize beyond having to get everybody a therapist. And, everybody in mental health is working on this. So I don't know how many, American Academy and National Academy panels I've been invited to on mental health and AI. And a lot of it is really scary. My son just decided to go work in this industry, so he's a psychologist and he's a good coder, so he can do a lot of things to your brain. I'm worried, but so there's a lot of potential there. But to me, what would be the most exciting thing is so I went to Vanderbilt to the center's called the Frist Center for Innovation, Autism and Innovation. And it's out of the engineering school and the business school. Now you can imagine how education and a lot of other departments feel about this, but thankfully I don't do university politics anymore. And it's run by a guy, Kayvon Stassen, who's a astrophysicist who has a son who has autism with a speech delay. And they are working on various things to use technology on a lot of this stuff. And one of the things they're working on is helping autistic people drive. Now, there's debate over whether autistic people are bad drivers or not. This autistic person is a very bad driver. So you might have noticed even when we were here, Patty was always driving, and I drive on the highway, but I try to never ever drive in town, especially in Washington, D.C., where I live. And I had my last accident 7 months ago. So just to tell you, I shouldn't really be driving at all, because the beeping and and Nick Robinson drove my Chevy Citation, even though he didn't have a car. It was my car, but he drove it. So a lot of autistic people have trouble driving. And so the people at Vandy have built this simulator that is pretty realistic, and you can sit in it and you can drive, and it's got wearables, so you're getting all your Oura Ring stuff and your heart rate and your blood pressure and all these things, and it's throwing things at you. And I mean, it makes sense that if you don't have a complete theory of mind, it's hard to tell whether somebody's going to pull out in front of you or not. I mean, the rule is they're not going to. So, we like rules, right? Okay. And they're making really good progress with this thing, teaching autistic people how to drive. So, could we use the same technology to put autistic people in the workplace and see how, and we could ramp up the social challenges and see how they do. So is this possible? I hope so. I think this is exciting, and it doesn't get into the whole we're curing autism thing. It's, it's helping people integrate more. So yeah, I'm excited about how technology can provide solutions to this, which is why this is a whole different tangent. But like the whole conversation around technology and mental health is completely screwed up. That's another lecture, but I'll come back and give that one if you want to. Want me to?
Great, great. Before we end, I want to just pause and ask for a round of applause for Laura Edwards, who has organized all of this, and our Writing and Learning Center staff and those from the Center for Student Success who have brought this great event to you. And then our final comment comes from someone here who says, "Cheers to Dr. Thorp. Thank you for your vulnerability, visibility, and advocacy."
You're welcome. Thank you.